The safe stood wide open, its steel doors gaping like a silent challenge. Inside were neat stacks of cash, more than most people would see in their lifetime, glimmering under the dim light of the study. But Thomas Mitchell did not move. The billionaire sat motionless in his leather chair, eyes half closed, breath slow and steady, pretending to be asleep. To anyone looking, it was a simple picture of a man resting. In truth, it was a test. Thomas had built his empire through caution, calculation, and relentless discipline. Yet beneath the surface, he carried scars no fortune could erase. Years earlier, betrayal from people he trusted had nearly destroyed him. Since then, suspicion had become his armor. Tonight, he wanted proof not of money, but of the character of those who served him. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Elena, his longtime housekeeper, stepped into the room with her son Eli at her side. The boy was 12, slight in frame, but carrying himself with a kind of quiet dignity. On his shirt glimmered a small rainbow pin, worn every day despite the whispers it drew. Thomas noticed everything, though his eyes stayed shut. He was waiting. Eli's gaze fell on the open safe. For a moment, his expression froze. The bills were in slight disarray, as though scattered by careless hands. He approached slowly, not with greed but with an instinct for order. Small fingers carefully aligned the edges, pressing each bundle until it stood perfectly straight, tidier than before. "Elijah," Elena whispered, her voice low but urgent. "Don't touch what doesn't belong to us." The boy leaned closer to his mother, his voice barely louder than a breath. "Mom, it was messy. Things should be neat, just like us, even if people don't like us." The words lingered in the air, fragile yet unshakable. Behind half-closed lids, Thomas felt a jolt run through him. He had prepared for dishonesty, perhaps even a child's temptation. Instead, what he saw was something altogether different: integrity, compassion, and a courage far beyond his years. The rainbow pin glittered as Eli straightened his shoulders, a simple emblem of truth carried in a world that often tried to crush it. For Thomas, it was like seeing a reflection of the boy he once had been. Long ago, he too had known what it meant to be different, to hide that difference from a world that ridiculed it. He remembered the sting of words from family, the silence of rooms that had no place for him. Unlike Eli, he had chosen to disappear behind walls of wealth and secrecy. But here was this child, standing tall at an age when most would crumble, refusing to bend or to mask who he was. The billionaire's chest tightened. For the first time in years, the fortress he had built around his heart cracked open. Life had shown him betrayal could come from the closest of hands. Yet in that quiet moment, he realized honesty could also come from the most unexpected place, the child of a maid, with nothing to prove and everything to lose. Carrying only a rainbow pin and an unshaken sense of self, Thomas kept his role as silent observer. But the decision was already forming. This test was no longer about a safe filled with bills. It was about the fragile yet powerful reminder that integrity does not bow to fear, and dignity does not depend on privilege. That night, in the shadows of his study, Thomas Mitchell saw that courage sometimes comes in the smallest forms. A boy of 12 had reminded him that living as your true self is worth more than any fortune locked behind steel doors. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt a flicker of hope. If Eli could walk through the world wearing his rainbow pin with pride, then perhaps even a man who had buried his truth for decades might one day step into the light. And so begins this story, a story of wealth, betrayal, courage, and the quiet power of a boy who refused to hide. If you want to hear how this journey unfolds, stay with us on Heart Stories, where truth and resilience are never just words, but living legacies. Jonathan Mitchell had always lived in the shadow of his older brother. Where Thomas carried restraint, Jonathan carried sharpness. Where Thomas preferred silence, Jonathan thrived on spectacle. They had built their empire together. But while Thomas relied on discipline, Jonathan relied on his ability to provoke. And provocation had become his weapon the moment he discovered a change in the household staff. It started small, a raised eyebrow when he noticed Elena's paycheck had grown, a smirk when he saw Eli walking down the marble hallway of Mitchell Tower, rainbow pin catching the morning light. To Jonathan, it was more than a boy passing through the corridors. It was an insult to tradition, a disruption to the pristine image he believed their family name demanded. At a shareholder meeting weeks later, Jonathan could not contain himself. The polished conference room was filled with suits, the sound of pen against paper echoing like distant thunder. Mid-discussion, Jonathan leaned back in his chair and let his words fall with deliberate venom. So now my brother sponsors the Maid'S gay kid. This place is turning into a circus. The sentence cut sharper than glass. A few shareholders shifted uncomfortably. Others lowered their eyes, but none spoke. Silence hung, heavy and complicit. Thomas remained still, hands folded, gaze lowered to the table. His silence was not weakness, though to Jonathan it must have looked like surrender. Insight. However, something else burned. It was not anger at being mocked for generosity, but the deeper sting of recognition. Jonathan's cruelty toward Eli was a mirror of wounds Thomas had carried his entire life. For years, Jonathan had ridiculed his brother's bachelorhood, throwing thinly veiled remarks about why Thomas never married. He suggested again and again that normal men did not isolate themselves. Behind closed doors, he had once spat the words that haunted Thomas still. "You'll end up alone because no decent man wants a freak." Now the same poison was being poured onto Eli, a boy who had done nothing but exist as himself. Thomas saw it clearly. The ridicule that once fractured his own youth was being recycled in front of him, directed at someone who had not yet even entered adulthood. And in that reflection, he recognized how cruelty travels through generations unless someone has the courage to stop it. Eli's presence had begun to draw Thomas out of the silence he had carried for decades. Each time the boy walked through the office, shoulders straight despite the stares, Thomas felt the weight of his own years of hiding. Every mocking remark from Jonathan pressed harder against the cracks already forming in the walls Thomas had built to protect himself. What unsettled Thomas most was not Jonathan's disdain, but how easily others allowed it. The boardroom's silence was its own betrayal. He had once mistaken silence for survival, believing it was better to avoid confrontation than to risk the truth. Now he saw silence as the oxygen that kept Jonathan's cruelty alive. Thomas did not rise to argue that day. He did not defend Elena or Eli with words. But within his chest, a shift was taking place. He knew he could no longer ignore Jonathan's sneers or dismiss them as mere sibling rivalry. This was not about wealth or reputation or even family loyalty. It was about whether he would allow the same old wounds to be inflicted on a child who deserved better than what he had once endured. The memory of Eli's quiet words in the study returned to him like a thread pulling him forward. Things should be neat, just like us, even if people don't like us. There was clarity in that innocence. The boy had taught him in a single breath that dignity was not earned by others' approval, but by refusing to let hatred rearrange your truth. In Jonathan's eyes, Thomas saw the past, the rejection, the shame, the mocking laughter that had carved silence into his life. In Eli's eyes, he saw a possible future, one where courage could stand taller than prejudice. It was then that Thomas began to understand that family is not always defined by blood, but by who you choose to protect when the world grows cruel. And sometimes the most dangerous divisions do not come from strangers outside, but from brothers who sit across the same table. The lesson pressed into him quietly. Silence can shield for a moment, but it cannot heal. To heal, one must speak, one must stand, even against the people who share your name, because dignity, once defended, becomes stronger than bloodlines. Jonathan Mitchell's resentment grew like a shadow that refused to shrink. What began as sharp remarks and public mockery soon hardened into something darker. In his mind, Eli's presence was more than an inconvenience, it was contamination. The sight of the rainbow pin flashing in the hallways of the Mitchell empire felt, to him, like a stain on a family crest. And with every passing day, Jonathan's obsession with preserving his idea of honor pushed him closer to betrayal. The plan was simple, or so he thought. A single item, small enough to slip unnoticed, valuable enough to spark suspicion, a rare Swiss watch from his private collection. With practiced care, he placed it into the folds of Elena's housekeeping card, the gleaming face buried under folded linen. To Jonathan, it was poetic justice. The maid and her son would be disgraced, cast out, and his brother forced to admit the mistake of bringing them into his world. But Jonathan underestimated Thomas. The years of betrayal had taught Thomas vigilance, and since allowing Eli into his life, his instinct to protect had only sharpened. He had already seen the contempt festering in Jonathan's eyes. Words were one thing, but Thomas knew his younger brother's hunger for control would not end with insults. He confided in Marcus Chun, a man whose life had been defined by uncovering deception as a federal investigator. Together, they crafted a quiet defense. Cameras were installed, discreet and invisible to anyone without a trained eye. Audio devices were placed in corners where shadows fell, and a plan was set into motion not just to clear Elena's name, but to reveal Jonathan's cruelty to all who needed to see it. In the privacy of his study, Thomas admitted what weighed on him most. He did not fear losing money or reputation. Both could be rebuilt. What terrified him was the possibility that Eli might believe the lies, that the boy's dignity could be crushed under the weight of false accusation. "I've hidden all my life," Thomas said to Marcus, his voice low, heavy. "But Eli, he stands tall, at 12. I won't let my own brother crush him." Marcus, a man hardened by years of evidence and confessions, nodded with the gravity of someone who had seen what silence allowed men like Jonathan to do. He knew this fight was not about one watch or one boy. It was about power, and whether that power would belong to those who built through honesty or those who destroyed through hatred. The trap Jonathan thought he had built for Elena and Eli was, in truth, a stage carefully prepared for his own downfall. Every careless move of his hand was now being documented, every sneer recorded, every whisper of his disdain captured for the world that would soon be watching. What Thomas understood, and what Jonathan did not, was that lies can control for a season, but truth requires only a single moment of light to unravel years of deceit. Thomas had spent his life hiding behind silence, believing it would shield him from scorn, but silence had only granted Jonathan more room to strike. This time, Thomas was prepared to let the truth speak louder than all the years of shadows. The waiting was heavy, but necessary. Thomas carried the burden of knowing his brother's hatred would soon surface in public view, and when it did, it would tear open wounds that had long been hidden. Yet he also carried the conviction that Eli would never again face those wounds alone. There is a cruel symmetry in betrayal. It often comes from the same blood that once promised to protect. Jonathan believed his scheme would restore control, but what he truly exposed was his own fear. Fear of a world that changes, fear of identities he could not erase, fear of a child's unshaken pride, and fear, once revealed, no longer holds the power it once claimed. The stage was set in silence, though no curtain had yet lifted. Jonathan Mitchell moved through the corridors of Mitchell Bureau with the calculated confidence of a man certain of victory. The Swiss watch gleamed faintly in his pocket, soon to be the weapon of his performance. He had rehearsed the moment countless times, the shock on Elena's face, the shame on Eli's, the vindication that would finally silence his brother's generosity. On a late evening shift, Jonathan made his move. He strode into the lobby where Elena's cart stood against the marble floor. Employees passed by, unaware of the storm about to break. With theatrical precision, Jonathan reached into the linen and pulled out the gleaming watch. He raised it high, his voice cold and cutting. Caught in the act, he declared, eyes locked on Elena. Eli's breath caught. The boy stepped forward instinctively, his small arms wrapping around his mother's waist. His hands trembled, but he did not unclasp the rainbow pin from his shirt. The emblem remained fixed, its colors defiant against the pale light of the lobby. Jonathan sneered at the sight. "This is the proof," he said. "That maid's son and his rainbow filth don't belong here." The room fell into stunned silence. A few employees looked away, uncomfortable but unmoving. Elena's face flushed with confusion and fear, but she said nothing, too overwhelmed by the spectacle. Eli buried his face against her, his small body shaking under the weight of accusation. Then the silence shifted. The heavy doors opened, and Thomas Mitchell entered, followed closely by Marcus Chun and a small group of journalists. Their cameras and notepads made the air hum with anticipation. Thomas's presence filled the lobby not with rage, but with a steadiness that was far more dangerous to his brother's scheme. Without a word, Marcus gestured toward the mounted screen. A grainy image appeared, then sharpened Jonathan himself, slipping the watch into the folds of Elena's cart. Gasps rippled through the crowd. There was no room for doubt. What had been staged as proof of theft was, in truth, evidence of malice. But Thomas was not finished. The next recordings unfolded a series of emails filled with venom, recordings of Jonathan's laughter as he mocked Eli's rainbow pin, and words that cut even deeper, spoken years before to Thomas himself. "You'll die alone, because no decent man wants a freak." The lobby froze. It was no longer about a watch or even about Elena and Eli. It was about the poison Jonathan had carried for years, finally dragged into the light where no silence could protect it. Eli's tears spilled as the words echoed across the marble walls. Yet instead of retreating, the boy lifted his head, rainbow pin catching the light once more. He had endured ridicule, but now the truth was no longer hidden. Thomas stepped forward, his voice steady, not raised in fury, but sharpened by resolve. "No, brother. The only disgrace here is hatred, and it ends tonight." The doors opened once more, and uniformed officers entered with measured steps. The metallic click of handcuffs filled the space as Jonathan's wrists were bound. For the first time, his confidence faltered, his eyes darting across the faces of employees who no longer looked away. The spectacle he had hoped to orchestrate had inverted, leaving him exposed before the very people he sought to impress. In that moment, the lesson was carved. Deep hatred can construct illusions, but truth requires no theater. Eli's tears, Thomas's resolve, Elena's dignity, they were stronger than Jonathan's schemes. Prejudice might shout loud in the darkness, but in the light it shrinks, powerless against evidence and courage. And so Jonathan was led away, his empire of contempt collapsing in plain view, while Thomas, Elena, and Eli remained standing in the only wealth that mattered: dignity preserved and courage unbroken. 6 months passed, yet the memory of that night in the Mitchell Tower lobby still lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. What had begun as a staged humiliation ended as a reckoning. Jonathan was gone, his name weighed down by the disgrace he had brought upon himself. But in the wake of his downfall, a new vision began to take shape. Thomas Mitchell did not allow silence to reclaim his life. Instead, he began to rebuild not the empire of wealth that had already stood, but the human foundation that had always been missing beneath it. Elena, whose dignity had been nearly destroyed by lies, was promoted to head of human resources. For the first time, she was able to design workplace policies rooted in fairness, protecting those who might otherwise be overlooked. Her quiet resilience had become a compass for the entire company. Eli flourished, enrolled in a school that nurtured rather than mocked. He carried the rainbow pin each day as though it were a shield. Teachers saw his focus, classmates saw his courage, and soon he became the chosen face of a program. Thomas launched the Rainbow Future Scholarship. The initiative promised education and opportunity for children who carried the weight of rejection simply for being who they were. For Eli, it was more than a scholarship. It was proof that his small act of honesty in a study filled with cash had grown into something that touched lives beyond his own. The day of the program's unveiling arrived. The atrium of Mitchell Tower was transformed, banners of soft light casting colors across glass walls. Employees filled the space. Shareholders gathered. Journalists prepared their pens. On stage stood Thomas, his presence no longer distant or guarded. His voice carried not the cold authority of a businessman, but the fragile honesty of a man finally stepping into the truth. If a boy of 12 can wear his rainbow pin with pride, Thomas said, pausing as his voice caught, then a man of 45 can finally wear his truth too. The room stilled. For decades, Thomas had let others speculate, ridicule, or dismiss him. Now he claimed what he had once hidden. "I am gay," he continued, the words simple, but heavy with years of silence breaking. "And it was Eli who gave me the courage to stop hiding." Applause erupted, not polite or restrained, but thunderous. Some employees stood with tears on their faces. Elena, standing near the front, pressed a hand to her mouth. Eli, overwhelmed, rushed forward. He wrapped his arms around Thomas with the fierce certainty of someone embracing not a billionaire, but the father he had found in spirit. Yet Thomas was not finished. He lifted a signed document before the audience. "Today, I am transferring 20% of my shares to the Rainbow Future Foundation. This company will no longer be remembered only for profit, but for fairness, dignity, and truth." The declaration reshaped the narrative. Mitchell Enterprises, once stained by Jonathan's arrogance, became a symbol of inclusion. The story of one boy's honesty had grown into a legacy written in policy, in scholarships, in lives that would never again feel abandoned. Jonathan lost everything because he clung to hatred. Thomas and Eli, bound not by blood but by courage, built something far stronger, a family defined by choice and truth, a legacy shining with every color of the spectrum. And so the tale closes, not with silence, but with voices raised for what is right. It reminds us that prejudice may try to wound, but integrity will outlast it. The rainbow does not ask permission to exist, it simply shines after the storm. Would you have had the courage, like Eli, to wear your truth no matter who stood against you? If this story touched you, don't forget to follow Heart Stories, where we share tales that remind us courage and compassion can change the world.